We're going to ask that we are opened up in prayer first, okay?
Almighty and most merciful God, thank you for Dr. Gore and for all the work that he does. We thank you for Abyssinian Baptist Church for having these kind of people to come in and talk to us and let us know that we can do anything that we put our mind to. We know that you are with us, and we know that you will guide us and show us the way. So we open this up now to listen to Dr. Gore, and thank you for his presence. Amen.
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 Thank you, thank you. Now, I, for one, I love to talk about the wonderful things that our presenters bring to us, but Dr. Gore is like a really humble individual. He's from Abyssinian. He grew up in Abyssinian. He was straightened out and corrected in Abyssinian. You know, and I'm going to tell you, y'all all know me, I'm Linda Thompson, but one of the things that I love doing for you as part of my service is bringing the best possible people around to nurture us mentally, spiritually, and physically, to bring out the best people to assist us. Now, a month or so ago, we had Dr. Uche Blackstock, okay, and Dr. Uche and Dr. Gore saw each other on the street, and she said, you know, I was just at the Abyssinian Baptist Church, you know, and they held me there, and they, you know, the book, and da-da-da-da-da, you know, and so someone else called me like that same day and said, you know, Linda, Bob Gore's son has a book, you know, you think we can get him at the church? You're one of our members, you know. I said, but of course. If one of our brothers or sisters or somebody that we love has done something fantastic, we like to highlight it and talk about it and share their gift that they give to us with other people. And I just love being able to present these fantastic folks to you. It always gives me an honor and a pleasure to find the diamonds that are out in the open and the diamonds that are in hiding that can bless you all, you know. So, Dr. Bob, Dr. Rob, I'm going to let him introduce himself because I don't want to say all of those fantastic things that are on my phone that you all think he's bigger than life. He is bigger than life. He's done some amazing things, and he's continuing to do things to save our brothers, to save our sisters who come under the gun. Literally, people who come under the gun and under the knife. And he's, through God, he's out there doing a good work with a scalpel and with some thread and some needle to try to bring these folks back to health and healing, and, you know, to do whatever it is that they're going to do in the future. So I'm going to let our good doctor speak a little about the fancy stuff that makes him who he is, you know, his bio, and then we're going to get into some nitty gritty. How does that sound?
Good.
All right. Thank you very much for coming, and I love you, and I continue to serve you. And Dr. Robert Gore Jr.
I want to thank Ms. Thompson. I want to thank the congregation at Abyssinian for having me back. This is a special homecoming, and it's kind of weird. I've been through so many different iterations of the vestry, from the old very dark green and to the blue, to the really tiny bathrooms when it was right across the hall, to my brother and I accidentally breaking the window for the church down here. So that, you know, there's so many memories that kind of come back to being in this space. But one thing that I've learned and known is that this is a place that's nurtured me for a very long time. I want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon to hear me talking. Ms. Thompson, who's been super gracious and has been an amazing host in helping orchestrate this event, but even helping me think through some ideas that may be very different for us to bring about, or at least give a slightly different version that might be beneficial for the community. I'm an emergency medicine physician, and I've been a physician for over 22 years, which makes me feel a little seasoned, and some of the people who helped raise me in this room are like, dang, you've been a doc for over 22 years. What does that make me? It makes you just as seasoned, even more seasoned. But I practiced medicine in different parts of the country and different parts of the world. I did my residency training in Chicago at Cook County Hospital. I went to medical school at SUNY Buffalo, upstate New York, and I went to undergrad at Morehouse College.
All right.
I had to put Morehouse in last, and part of that is also just to honor the spirit of Dr. Butts, who I wish was here, but I know he's here with us in spirit, because there's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now was influenced by both him and Reverend Dr. Mason. And having them as mentors really helped me figure out how to articulate things that my father had been saying for many years, and how do we make sure that the community is at its best? How do we make sure that the community we serve is taken care of? And what can we do to become active participants in this process? Not just, as Reverend Hoggard was speaking about a little bit earlier, not just moving beyond just the word itself, but really embodying what these different words that we've been learning actually mean. How do you become these vehicles for change? It just so happens, because of what I do in emergency medicine, I come in contact with a lot of people who are in distress and are not at their best. And things that have stood out particularly have been young men and young people who've been affected by violent trauma. I've been practicing at Kings County Hospital in central Brooklyn, in East Flatbush, for the past 18 years. And it's very different when you see violence and trauma up close and personal. People who are involved in pastoral counseling, you know what it's like to have very intimate conversations with people who've been affected by things that are horrendous, that are very deep-seated trauma that even their own relatives and family don't know. And as a physician, I experience the very same things, but we want to make sure that we provide something to help people at least understand the trauma that they've experienced, and figure out creative modalities, and really even tapping into things that they've already known so that they can come at their best. But that big thing is really understanding and recognizing that something bad has happened. I'm going to stop right now, so I don't just do a regular lecture and talk right here like I do often, but I'm going to pass the mic to Ms. Thompson.
Thank you. So we family here, and we can do things like real fancy, or we can be real, and it's necessary in dealing with our community that we keep it simple, but we also keep it straight. We keep it honest, and that we are deliberate in the way in which we are operating, and deliberate in the way in which we can help each other heal. Now, we all know that our good doctor helps heal people. We do know that bloody people, damaged people, broken people end up on Dr. Rob's table. Okay, so but before we get to that, before we get to the amazing doctor that he is in healing people, helping people heal, what was it like for you growing up in Brooklyn?
Growing up, I don't think I realized there was anything wrong until I left and came back. When you're growing up in a place, you're like, oh wow, this is home. And these are the people that live on my block. These are the people who live in public housing across the street from where we live. These are the people we play with in the park right across the street. And I grew up in pre-gentrified Fort Greene, Brooklyn, which looks very different than it does now. I grew up in Fort Greene and in Flatbush, which also looks very different now. Because of people with different levels of economic access coming in, and unfortunately some of us moving out. But anytime you grow up in a place, in a space where there are major disparities regarding income, you see that sharp demarcation with the haves and the have-nots. And as a kid, you don't really see that until you see something, or you have conversations, or go someplace where it's like, oh wow, you mean you don't carry razor blades to school? You mean, oh wow, I don't have to cross the street when I see certain people coming away. Or, oh wow, whenever I leave the house, I gotta make sure that I look like I don't have money because I have to navigate this space. And if I look like I have money, then they're gonna get me. If I look like I don't have money, or if I look like I'm dead broke, it looks like they're gonna get me because I'm an easy target. So you've gotta figure out how to navigate these thin lines. Coming in here, my father would be at church all day growing up. We would go to the flea market, and he's still here all day. you know, as a kid in middle school or high school, like, I can't stay up there all day. I love these people, but I can't do that. So I would leave early, which was 1 o'clock or 1:30, and it's just 1:30 right now. So I'd be itching to get out of here, go back to Brooklyn. But the aesthetics and the things that I wore were very important. And I knew when if we came up in the car, I'm with my parents, there's protection. But if I left here and had to take the 3 train or the 2 train up here and take it down Atlantic Avenue and then switch over to the Q train, I can't look like I'm coming out of church. No, it is very serious. I can't wear shoes that are slippery at the bottom because if I have to run or if I get into a fight, I need to be able to defend myself. I can't look like I can be taken advantage of. And this whole concept of being vulnerable inwardly and externally becomes a point of your own individual survival. And a lot of the work that we do, in medicine, there are 2 key things. I see the world through the lens of an emergency physician. The first thing is keep you alive. And the second thing is through the public health lens, and that is how do we make sure that you thrive. But growing up here, my goal was to make sure that I survive. And then if I survive, then I can get to this point that everybody talks about, going to school, becoming a physician, and contributing back to the community. That's when you're thriving. But there are very many times, and some of you all sons and daughters who I grew up with probably may have had that same conversation with you, or they may not have shared some of those things. But the goal is survival. And having a community around you to help care for you ensures that survivability is more than just a concept, but something that can be actuated and take you to a point that you're actually able to thrive and give back to the community.
Thank you. You lived around some pretty cool people who became cool. They weren't cool at first, but they became cool as you knew them. Tell us about a couple of those people.
I guess one in particular. So I can say today, Alvin Bragg.
All right. Yes.
Alvin. I met Alvin probably. I was definitely in elementary school, and at least I clearly remember him being in elementary school. And Alvin has been pretty much the same way he was back then. The facial hair has changed. We both have some gray hair now, and have families of our own. But he was the same person. And I spoke to Sister Terry about from Harlem Network News about us coming up together, and I'm not surprised at the work that he's doing. I'm very proud of the work that he's doing. I actually joined part of his transition team when he was elected to become the Manhattan DA's office, and we've spoken in depth with his team about violence and trauma and providing solutions to this community itself. So I think that's one claim to fame, and I'm very happy and super proud of what he and his team just accomplished. Growing up in Brooklyn too, there was this up-and-coming filmmaker named Spike Lee who used to live a couple of doors down. Right. And we just saw that, this wiry guy with glasses who was trying to make a film. And we found out, parts of the story later about him financing a film using credit cards and stuff like that. We just knew him as Mr. Lee's son, who was a filmmaker. Mr. Lee was the music teacher on the block. He taught the kids on the block how to harmonize. He taught us about musical scales. And so it was really a community, and even though I don't really know Spike, I knew who he was. I know his younger brothers and sisters a lot better, but he always made sure he reached back and brought people from the block who were old enough to participate in things that he was doing. He had people he mentored. He had people who he employed, and all the kids who were in high school who could worked for 40 acres and a mule. They did modeling for his for the clothing company. They were I'm not sure the proper terminology for people who work on film sets, but he had them engaged in different aspects of what he was doing, and so if you had an idea and you had a vision, it was supported by people who lived on the block, which is kind of like what Abyssinian is like. You have ideas and you have people who are in this building who can help you manifest that even if you don't believe in yourself. But those are some of the people we came in contact with growing up, just to name a few.
That's wonderful. I'm always when I look at people that I know now as adults, I always kind of say to myself, what made this person who they are? Who was around this person who made him or her who they are? And Dr. Bob gets to look around and talk about all of these you can see it when you read the book. Okay, when you read the book, you'll see that he had a strong foundation of good, honest, wonderful people who helped influence him. When you look back at that foundation, Dr. Bob, what do you say about those people who are around you who really helped you to pave your way to where you are today?
If I'm looking through an academic lens and professor, and as a scientist, things that keep people alive and healthy and well are often our social support systems. As a matter of fact, that's one of the components of the social determinants of health, which impact our overall health and well-being. And so for the stuff that I'm doing right now is purely the result of having an extensive support system. In the hospital, when I have somebody who comes in, they've been shot, they've been stabbed, they're having chest pain, they can't breathe because of asthma, they're having belly pain because they ate something they weren't supposed to eat, or they have some sort of anatomical obstruction that's preventing them from digesting food. There's an entire team of people that come to the aid of that person to ensure that their well-being is maintained, from whether this is the physician, to the nurse, to the clerk who checks them in, to the people who, to the receptionists who help, and the patient care reps who help navigate their families safely in throughout the process while their loved one is being cared for, because it's a scary situation. But it's all, all this stuff kind of comes back to how do we create really comprehensive levels of support. So the stuff that I'm doing is purely been birthed out of that, having access to that space. When we see people in the hospital and in our communities who don't do well, it's typically because those safety nets and those support systems don't exist. Those safety nets were there, but they've been so inundated with stress and stress after stress after stress, and if they're limited in number, those systems wind up breaking. We see that with, I work in the public hospital. I spent most of my career within the public hospital space, and we are open as a safety net. But when there's no other, when people can't go anywhere else, when the numbers of chronic diseases are increasing, when the amount of violence is increasing, at least more visible, then what happens to those safety nets? They crumble. The human body is a miraculous, dynamic vehicle and vessel, but it can only withstand so much. When it's in a position to be able to adapt to changes, it's great. When it's not able to adapt, we were looking at these old antiquated models of making sure that we just stay strong without being able to move, then they start to break. So there's a concept called allostasis, which is really the body's ability to adapt to change. Again, Reverend Harlem was speaking about, he didn't really say it in that form, but he was talking about, how do we see Abyssinian when people say their name, and really talking about, is this institution going to be able to adapt to the future? Are people going to be able to come into this space and grow with it, or are we going to focus on what we were? My father's book was called "We've Come This Far," and so what's the next destination? Where are we moving next as an institution? But really, holding true to creating these models that allow us to adapt to changes is important and essential for our survival. When our systems aren't able to adapt, when we try to stay too strong and not understand, what is it, Antigone? They said the tree that bends and sways survives the storm. But when we aren't able to bend and sway, we crumble. And that's what's known as allostatic load, which compromises our bodies, it compromises our immune systems. It also leads to our ability to not be able to handle stress. And we can't handle that stress, we break, we crumble, and we die prematurely.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. So when you look at the foundation of what your mom and dad gave you, the foundation, what they taught you, what they showed you, what they instilled in you, how do you look at that and then see how it influenced you to be protected from some of the many things that were going on in your life, living in Brooklyn in the 80s, in the 70s, and the 80s, to be able to be resilient, you being set apart in many ways from the kids down the block from you. What did they instill in you to make you be able to survive that?
So, you all see my father every week with the camera and the bow ties, and you know part of the story of how he captures images to help show people at their best. That's actually a line from something he told me a long time ago. How do we help people see themselves and become their best? But he's a community organizer, and who happens to have a background in media and television, and was really doing some revolutionary things in the 70s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, even up to now with imaging and altering, not in altering, but really enhancing perceptions of how people see themselves in a very public space. My mother was an educator and saw tons of potential in students who came from very challenging circumstances, but had this very unique and has this very unique ability to see people at their best and to be able to extract that talent. Combine that with two people who are, I don't want to say opinionated is not the word, but very strong-willed. Who are raising a very strong-willed child was very helpful, because I always knew I had support. But I also had people who were going to hold me accountable for what I was doing. I had people who were going to teach me every step of the way. Every moment in our household was a learning experience. You wake up in the morning, you're brushing your teeth, you're learning something from a book. What are the lessons you're learning from that? What do you see on the street? I learned a whole lot about pattern recognition from my mother. She's just trying to keep me from getting lost when I'm walking down the street. What does that building show you? If you're downtown Brooklyn, what's the tallest building? Oh, the Williamsburg Bank. So if you get lost, what do you have to look for? You look for the Williamsburg Bank. It's like, oh, okay. You're looking at the signs. The signs go east, if you're in Flatbush or, East Flatbush, they go east, whatever, east 19th, east 20th, east 21st. As those numbers keep going, up, that means you're going further and further east. And so if you're looking at things on a map, if somebody says, I gotta go east, I'm like, oh, I gotta go east, because East New York and East Flatbush is that way. So looking at things in your environment, everything becomes a learning experience. For my father, learning how to greet people. What is your handshake like? Are they making eye contact? Does the person look like they need help? What are the signs of somebody who needs help? What are the signs of somebody who's in distress? What are the signs of somebody needs you just leave them alone and back off? How does somebody, what can you learn from this person based on their outward appearance? What are their fingernails? All these things that I do as a physician, I had a foundation from the parents. And even one more important thing is, how often are we reading? I wasn't allowed to leave the house without a book. And I remember the days, and we would come from Brooklyn without a car. And, we live in Fort Greene. We take the B-54 bus down Myrtle Avenue. Then we take the A train over at J Street, and then take it up to 125th, and then wait forever 125th to catch either the C or one of the other, what's it, the B. I know it's changed now because
It's still C and B.
It's still C and B? Okay. We would take those up here and then walk down the street, but I always had a book with me. And these were, it could be a comic book, it could be anything. I had civil rights books. We had the Golden Legacy comic books that we bought from up the street. I forgot this brother who was on, not Adam Clayton Powell, who was on Frederick Douglass. He had a little shop. We used to buy some of those things from there. But I was always reading, because if you can read, you can start recognizing patterns a lot more effectively. If you read a whole lot of stuff, you start knowing the history behind it. And then people who present themselves, as a physician, it's important that we remain objective. And a lot of times, and some of this stuff stems from our own religious backgrounds and spiritual practices, but people like to see things as black and white. When you learn the stories behind people, then it starts to get a little bit more colored. Not just because we're colored in here, but things start to get a little bit more color. You start to see the shading, and you start to see people for what they are, as opposed to what category you want to put them in. And so the reading has to become paramount. Learning patterns, learning to recognize, learning the history behind every place and every person that you see, from where you think they're from, picking up their accents. Are they from the Caribbean? Are they from the Deep South? Is that a hardcore Deep South accent, meaning they just came up from here, or they've been up here as a part of the Northern migration? So these are all things that wind up taking place with the education. A lot of things that were encouraged, even if I had 1,000 questions for my parents at times where they didn't really want to have those conversations. I guess they figured, look, if we don't answer these questions now, he's going to bug somebody else later about it. And we want him to learn to be at his best. And we have to help this young brother in his neurodivergence, who may not see things in a very clear pattern, but help him learn these ways so that he can be a productive member of our community.
So, did your parents tell you that they was putting you in a certain place to get to a certain place? Did they say anything to you about your future as they were grounding you and molding you?
So my mother's a teacher, and so every summer, you want to go, you go to summer camp if you're able to. But I was fortunate to go to summer camp, and she's like, yeah, you can go to camp, you can play all these sports and do whatever, but you got to do something academic. You have to do your workbook pages in your math book, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this. She's like, yeah, you do this first, then you can go out and play. Right. Or I could go play first because she knew I was hyper, had a lot of energy, and if your energy is very much scattered and almost entropic and somewhat disordered, you've got to do things that help. Now I know the science behind it, but you have to really regulate your neurological system so that you can actually sit still and do work. And so I would always have, the academia was always balanced with the physical activity. And it wasn't like you have to do this. It's like, okay, now you're going to do this, and this is what we do. Mommy and daddy go to work, and this is your job. This is what you have to do. We clean up, you're going to clean up. You're part of this household. And it's kind of like, oh, okay. So I don't know anything different. Coming to community events. I remember the first community event that I really remember being at. So I remember David Dinkins was the city clerk. And I remember my father got laid off from working at WNYC when he was in charge of black programming, and pissing off a lot of clear people around the city because they were doing programming that people didn't really like because it was showing our people at their best. And I remember he got let go, and I remember they did a tribute, and I was trying to figure out, why are they doing a tribute here for somebody who's still alive? I kind of figured out what tribute, but usually I saw flyers for somebody who passed away, and I remember David Dinkins was here. And I saw all these different community members coming in, Reverend Butts, Harkins wasn't here yet. Harkins came maybe a little bit after that. Dr. Proctor. And so you had all these different people who came together to make sure that my father was in a better position. I'm like, wow. I was like, he must be doing some really important things. And that was tied. Then it was also tied to the voter registration campaign for the Jesse Jackson campaign. A lot of that stuff. I remember him and other groups meeting here to do that kind of work, and I'd have to come up here with him. I didn't really want to be up here. I'm not gonna lie to you. You're a little kid. The last thing you want to do is hang out with your parents after school or on the weekend. But you saw what people were doing to dedicate themselves to the improving the community. My mother grading papers and seeing students on the block and seeing people. Walking in the neighborhood and them having this shining and this increased vibrance when they saw her just walking down the street. I'm like, wow, she's doing something and connecting dots in a way. So I guess this is what I'm supposed to be doing. You learn by example, and if the examples aren't there, if the discipline behind the examples that are being taught aren't there, then how does this repetition that you're exposed to create a level of familiarity? The work and what we're seeing right here and things that are talked about in the book are purely the reflection of many people who've contributed to developing this discipline and providing these levels of support so that I can also come back and be a part of this community ecosystem that is supporting itself and helping it become more restorative in a way that allows everything to thrive.
Okay. So we know that you went to that famous school in Atlanta. But
Yes.
how did you become a doctor? How did that happen?
I became a doctor through some exposures, again, support system mentors. I've known doctors who are PhDs and doctors of divinity. I remember, Dr. Butts, Dr. Proctor, and it was like, oh, they're doctors, but I was like, I don't really want to be a preacher. I'll talk to people, but I don't know if this is being in the pulpit that is going to be for me. But I got injured in the summer of 1992. I was running track, and I screwed up my ankle a bunch of times, and it was taped shut. It was taped up pretty tightly, but I had an opportunity to go away to a running camp. Actually, first I went to an engineering camp at Prairie View, Texas, Prairie View A&M University, and I've been doing engineering and architecture stuff for about 5 summers, from middle school on up through high school. And I love the design aspect of it, but I like math, but I wasn't a fan of physics. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this long term. And so the Prairie View program, although it was fun to get away from your parents for a few weeks, I was like, I don't know if this path is for me. And then that same summer, about 2 weeks later, I got an opportunity to go away to the running school, which is a cross-country camp in the Adirondacks. And I was going to train cross-country running for an intense week of training, 2-3-a-day training sessions. But I was injured because I had stepped in potholes and screwed up my ankle. It was so bad that you could move my heel back and forth like this. I had stretched out all the ligaments. But I was still going to camp because we paid the money for it, and I was going to go. And I was going to get away from Brooklyn because 92, there were a lot of things that were happening in 92. You know, Rodney King was 92. You know, the Crown Heights riots were 92. It was 91 to 92. I can't remember. I'm having a brain fart right now. But there were a lot of things tied to violence and trauma. I was like, I just got to get away. But when I went up to the running camp, I couldn't train as intensely with the other campers. I could train, but I wasn't as fast as I'd like to be. My cardio wasn't what it needed to be, and I had to spend a lot of time with the sports docs getting taped up before training and after training. And, you know, if I'm sitting there, you know, I see Ms. Laverne in the back, and, you know, who's known me for a very long time and has entertained some really interesting questions. I probably presented myself. So if I'm in the room with you, I'm going to ask you questions. I'm going to ask you about everything that you have on, what about your life, and to the point that your mother and your father are kind of like, oh gosh, I wish I could take my child away from here right now. You're embarrassing me. But I would ask anybody any kind of question. And I happened to ask the sports docs about what they were doing. That was the first time I think I'd ever seen people enjoy what they were doing for a living. And my mother seemed happy when she was after school. You know, I'm not saying she didn't like what she did, but I only saw her after school. I didn't see her in the classroom except for when she covered a couple of my classes when we were at the same school. But she was serious in those classes. So it was like, so that wasn't happy. That was mama the disciplinarian. And, you know, my father, you see him after work, and, you know, if you're acting up and stuff, you know, he's yelling at you for doing something you're not supposed to be doing. So you don't see them in their element. But this is the first time I've seen people in their element, and they enjoyed what they were doing. They were working with young people. They were providing a service and being in a helping profession, and they were connecting with people and allowing them to get back out there and do something that they enjoyed. And I was like, I want to do that. And they started letting me tape up people's ankles and wrap up their knees, and started talking about a little bit about the science behind what they were doing. And so I came home, I was like, I think I want to be a doc. The following summer, you know, following my junior year in high school, I didn't do so well with running. Academics were fine, but running, I was repairing injuries. And I said, I'm going to have a great senior year. And I met up with a coach, one of my track coaches. He said, if you want to do this, you're going to have to put in the mileage. So I ran 500 miles the summer between my junior and senior year. And that averages about between 50 to 80 miles a week, which is on average 10 plus miles a day. And I didn't really, you know, you might have active recovery days, which is a lot. And my cardio was great. My running abilities were great, but I didn't understand the fact that you probably needed to lift weights and balance out some of those muscles, and I wound up having an overuse injury. And I wound up having to see an orthopedic surgeon named Answorth Allen. And my mother had seen him for her back and some spinal stuff before, but what my mother didn't know when she first went to him was that Dr. Allen was black. You know, I never had a black doc before. I'd seen Dr. Wells here before, but he wasn't my doc. I knew he existed, but I had never seen anybody who was young and who was a physician or a surgeon. And my mother told me about him, and she said, you know, I had to see him anyway because I couldn't walk. And she told him a little bit about me. And so when I met him, he said, oh, you know, your mother told me about you. I heard you want to be a doc. And I was like, yeah, I do. And he said, I do sports medicine. I'm like, wow. So it was really exciting. He's worked with professional athletes at this time, and he said, if you want to be a doc, we're going to make sure we get you there. And so as a 17-year-old kid, I'm like, okay, I can be a doc. This guy was a surgeon, said I can be a doc. I'm going to make it happen. And he had me shadow him in the operating room. Now I realize how big a deal it is to be able to spend time in the operating room at the hospital for special surgeries, watching one of the top orthopedic surgeons in the world operate. Had no idea. I'm just thinking, oh, this is almost like a field trip for me, and it's just I get to see some really interesting things. But I didn't realize that I was being groomed, and the stuff that he was teaching me as a pre-medical student, as a high school student, was something that I would carry out, and I was making sure you give opportunities for other people who are coming from different spaces so they can at least start to envision themselves in these spaces. If you can't envision yourself in this life, if you can't envision yourself as this professional, as this caretaker, even in the role of as a parent, if you don't have those examples, how are you going to make sure these things take place? And so with Dr. Allen mentoring me as a high school student, and I went back to work for him when I was in college, there was no question whether or not I was going to go to medical school and become a physician. You have hiccups along the way, but I knew I was determined to make that happen.
Okay.
When you were in medical school, how many people looked like you?
There were 3 brothers in my class, and we had 3 brothers and maybe 5 black females, 3 sisters, 5 sisters in the class, and 1 or 2 Latinos, and that was actually a lot for most medical schools. The year behind me, it was only 1 brother, and coming out of the Atlanta University Center and coming out of HBCU, and I didn't go to school with white people until medical school. We had like 2 white kids at my high school, maybe 3. One we thought was Puerto Rican because she grew up in Harlem and talked like everybody else, and it wasn't until we met her mother. She grew up in the projects just up the street, and we met her mother to attract me. And we go, oh wow, Barry's white, and so
Never knew.
So never knew. We were seeing him in summer camp.
I know Barry.
Lily
I know Barry.
Please tell
I
her
know
said
Barry.
hello.
I know Barry. She grew up next door to us.
Yeah.
I know Barry.
Right. So people know I'm not making these stories up, but I had no idea what it was like to be in a space where people didn't look like you, or not everybody was supportive. Now I feel like I had support when I was in medical school in Buffalo, but I was used to seeing a lot of us, and I was used to having a lot of us in study groups. I went to school with all dudes, with the exception of Spelman across the street in Clark, Atlanta, which is like 70 to 80% women. I went to school with a lot of guys who were doing really incredible things and worked hard, and I get to medical school and I'm like, where's that community? And it wasn't until, I had a conversation with my father and my grandfather. My grandparents attended Abyssinian. They attended Abyssinian in Riverside. My grandfather sang in the men's chorus up here, and was a really incredible figure. But as they got older, they spent more of their time in Buffalo, New York, where I was in medical school. So I would get to have these conversations almost on a daily, definitely a weekly basis with elders. And having a conversation with my dad, having a conversation with my mother's parents. I remember they asked me, I'm not supposed to say these words in here, but I'm trying to figure out. He said, why the heck do you think you went to all these fancy schools, and met with all these people? And I was kind of like, oh. He's like, you got to build these communities. And my grandfather would tell the story. He said, you got to go for me. And he got a full scholarship to go to, he got a full scholarship to go to Shaw University down in North Carolina, and got a half scholarship to go to Howard, but didn't go because his family didn't have the money to get him there, to physically get him there. And it's during the Depression, so he had to take care of the family. And he dug ditches, worked at Bethlehem Steel and other things up in Buffalo, New York, when the family went up there for the Northern Migration. And so hearing these stories about how he had the opportunity, full tuition, room and board paid for, but you physically couldn't get there. And now you're complaining about there not enough people there. He said, well, if it's not there, you got to put it there. And it kind of came back to the thinking about Dr. Allen. It's like, oh, wow. I was like, I got to bring people on board. I got to make sure I mentor people and make sure they come in these spaces, because these can be some lonely spaces. But it's also good for patient care when people look like the patient, when the providers look like the patients. It doesn't mean that our allies don't do very good work, but when you understand the community and you understand the language, you understand the slang, where they're coming from, the neighborhood dynamics, and somebody says, I don't take my medication, for a reason, because I can't get to that pharmacy, or I can't get to this place, or I can't afford it, because now I'm making the decision of feeding myself or taking my medication. I think food is probably more important than the medication. You're gonna make certain decisions. If you realize that I can't go to this pharmacy that you keep sending these medications to because it's kind of a war zone and I'm an older person, I can't go to these places because it's not safe for me, and you say, oh, this person's not taking their medications because of non-compliance, then that's a problem and things that we've got to consider. And so understanding, having people who are coming from our community was something that I wanted to make sure that I helped put people there. And some of it was because I was lonely, but it was like if I don't do it, what's gonna happen? Having these conversations with Reverend Butts and Mason, about this kind of stuff. They also went to Morehouse and they had blazed a lot of trails before, and sometimes you gotta listen to people other than your parents to help show you things that they've been telling you all along. And so a lot of these things were echoed, and that became a mission.
So you were living Sankofa. Did you realize it at that time?
Yeah, in medical school I did, because I got it tattooed on my arm. That was my first tattoo, was a Sankofa tattoo. You got to go back and fetch it, and meaning look to the past so that you can move forward, and you draw on the strength from past experiences and from the ancestors, and that leads you to give you the ability to lead a positive and productive future. So I wanted to embody those words, and that just became something that I did and still do.
Wonderful. Are you all having a good time?
Absolutely, yeah.
I'm enjoying hearing how this humble man, this great man, became who he is. So we're going to talk a little bit about your first experience in the emergency room as a doctor. What was that like?
When somebody called me, I remember my first day of residency and walking down the halls, and it was terrifying. I don't think I even have that story in here, but I remember, two things happened. One, I'm walking down the hall and somebody's like, doc, 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 and I'm just walking down the hall because I'm not used to people calling me that, and I look down and I realize it's like, there's nobody in front of me, and this person, the voice is getting louder and louder, and you do one of those, and I look back, I'm like, look to my side, I was like, nobody's there, and I'm like, oh shoot, so I did a full 3, almost not a full 6, I did a 180, and I'm like, oh shoot, they're talking to me. And I'm like, oh man, I hope I can answer this question. And I was terrified. And I think somebody just wanted directions for, or needed me to say, I think it was a nurse, wanted me to sign something. I'm like, whew, okay, I can sign something. And then I proceeded to go down the hallway of Cook County Hospital. I was on the cardiology consult service, and I was going to do a consultation on a gentleman. He was probably in his maybe 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Sometimes when people have had hard living, you can't actually tell exactly how old they are. But he was young-ish, but had old-ish medical issues, and he had already had a below-the-knee amputation because of diabetes. And I was in there to do the clearance screening for him to have another surgery. And so I go in there to introduce myself to him, and then he starts crying, and I'm like, I was like, this is only my first day. I was like, I'm not used to people crying on me. I was like, I don't know a whole lot right now. And I was like, I don't want him to have this much faith in me because I don't know how to address it. And people also weren't open to men expressing themselves with outward emotions. And so this is 2002. And some of you all who remember times way before that, are even like, oh wow, yeah, it was really something if a guy's crying in 2002, because you remember that men just didn't shed tears. But this guy's crying, and I'm like, trying to keep it inside and trying to make eye contact, because that's what they tell you in school, you got to make eye contact. And I'm like, yeah, there, I'm sorry, in an awkward way. And he says, you don't understand, I'm so proud of you. And I'm like, oh shucks, now you get me crying. And he said, we don't see a lot of people like you. I'm from Chicago. Born in Cook County Hospital, and not me. My father was, but if you're black and you weren't Catholic, you were born at Cook County Hospital. That was the hospital for you. Same thing like people who were black in Harlem or in the Bronx, going to Jacoby or Lincoln or Kings County in Brooklyn. That's where we were allowed to go. Notice I said we were allowed, but he said that. He said, I'm so proud of you. And, there were a number of docs who were melanated, who came from the diaspora, but their families hadn't come up through northern migration. Their families weren't coming up in these spaces. So he said, I want you to know how proud I am of you. And it's like, okay. I was like, I guess this just got real. And I was like, I have to do well. I have to be here. I have to become more than just an exception. We've got to really create these spaces. And so the work becomes more than just a science experiment. It becomes more than an exercise in healthcare, but really looking at how to connect with people and how to inspire confidence, how to learn from them so that the patients themselves are really a part of this ecosystem of your well-being as a provider. A lot of times I was speaking to one of the docs that used to be at Kings County. She has a book on healthcare disparities that's coming out very soon. And she spoke about patient-centric, being patient-centric, but a lot of times people think about what we do for the patients rather than what the patients do for ourselves, and how they can help us, how do we learn from them in that process. And I thought that was a really interesting concept to mention. But if we're really a part of this, this experience, we have to learn from everybody in that space. I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've been doing that for almost 10 years. And I also been studying Judo almost 4 years. And one of the tenets of Judo, there's Jita Kaioi. There are two tenets. One is Serioko Zenyo, and that means maximum efficiency and minimum effort. And the other one is Jita Kaioi, which means mutual benefit. And anytime you're engaging with an exercise, with one of your training partners, you have to ensure that there's a mutual benefit. So are you taking care of your partners? Are you taking care of your staff members? Are they taking care of you? And if you don't look at it as this beneficial, as this true synergy, then I think we miss the opportunity for connection. And we miss those opportunities for connection, people don't do as well. And we've seen the outcomes of people who don't do well.
Wow. What was a typical day like for you in urban emergency room?
Oh, man.
Tell it.
So
give it to us straight, please.
I'm not sure if any of you all been to Kings County Hospital before. If you've been to Lincoln Hospital, if you've been to Jacoby Hospital in the emergency department, if you have been to Highland Hospital out in Oakland, if you've been to LA County, it's all the same thing, just different accents to the people. But it just so happens when you're in central Brooklyn, when you're in the borough, we always call it the borough, but not to exclude people from Manhattan or the Bronx or Queens.
Harlem.
But when you're in the borough, it's different. People live on top of each other in a very different way, and I don't know if it's because of the Caribbean influence in Brooklyn is now making its way to the Bronx, and people are starting to see, oh, this is what it's like when people live very communally, and everybody's all up close and personal. And I know our West African brethren and sisters over here up in Harlem, you're also starting to see those effects at the hospitals around here, but it gets thick up in there. It's thick, it's chaotic, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of accents, there's a lot of, I know my wife's from Ethiopia, and I spent time in Ethiopia with her, and I've also spent time in Kenya working at Kenyatta National Hospital, which is the public hospital. And it wasn't until while I was in Kenya, I was like, something is different. And I recognized the same thing when I was in Ethiopia. I was like, something's so different about these people here. And I realized, I was like, East Africans are often very quiet. I was like, so I know we're related to the West Africans here, just by the intonation and how we're dressed, and how all these groups of people, have grown up without intercoms, but have found major ways to communicate. So the reason why I have to describe that is because Hope Mason, who's a friend and sister of Abyssinia, we also work together at Kings County, and it's an intense place, and I have to tell you the sounds. Because if you don't understand the sounds behind it, you don't understand what's required for you to process and to regulate your entire system so that you can take care of people. There's pure chaos. People aren't well, they're scared, they're terrified, and you're managing their emotions, their medical problems, their surgical problems, and you're managing the emotions of their families. On top of not having any space to move or work because there's no other hospital. Hospitals are closing left and right. And there's no place for people to go. And so you have the chaos of the environment, you have the chaos and you know of what the patients are experiencing, and you're trying to figure out what they have is going on and how do you treat them effectively given the sets of your resources, and you still have to perform. And so that resilience, that adaptability, I don't just say it just because I think it sounds cool. It's very real, and you have to become very creative in how you disseminate information to patients and their families. How do you get them to buy in and have confidence within you and your decision making? Sometimes when your colleagues don't really have that confidence and they look at you, this is what's happening in medical school, and as a resident, they'd be like, hey, let me holler at you. You know, Chicago, they had a little different kind of Southern twang, and they'd be like, they'd be like, come here, I need to talk to you. And these are some of the OGs who you knew were OGs because you seen some of the scars and you knew some of their background, but they'd be like, I don't know what they just said. And so I need you, as a medical student in Buffalo, they'd be like, I don't know what they just said. And I got the short white coat on or a very clean white coat on as a resident. And you're realizing that you're trying to convey very complex concepts in a very simplified way, and that's what it's like to be in the emergency department. And we're not even taking on the smells, and the impending and the possibility of death that's occurring if you don't act accordingly. If I don't sleep properly, if I'm not paying attention to what the person is telling me, if I miss subtle cues, where they're from, what happened, why are they like this? That means somebody can die. I had a woman that came in 2 or 3 days ago, and she had like symptoms consistent like a viral infection, fever, body aches and stuff like that. We did a COVID test, COVID was negative. Did the flu test is negative. Hadn't been around any kids. And the resident was like, oh, she probably got viral infection. I was like, yeah, she's still tachycardic, meaning her heart rate is still elevated. She still has a fever. We're giving her Tylenol, we're giving her Motrin. We don't see anything in her urine. We don't see anything on the chest x-ray, so she doesn't have a pneumonia. And he's like, oh, I don't know. She may just have a viral infection. She's young. And I was like, where you asked her? I was like, where are you from? And she's like, I'm from Guyana. I said, when did you come back from Guyana? She'd come back like a couple of weeks ago. I was like, send a peripheral smear. We need to make sure this lady doesn't have malaria. I was like, you get bit by a bunch of mosquitoes? And she's like, yeah, I got bit by a bunch of mosquitoes. And so knowing how to, connect the dots and within seconds, because you got 30 or 40 other people that you gotta that you have to take care of. Some are throwing pee on the floor. Some of them are having psychiatric, experiencing psychosis. Some of them are experiencing delirium and they're altered, they're having strokes. And you've got to be able to process all of this stuff. And you've got to go to a quiet space in your head so that you can sort things out. And I speak sometimes about neurodivergence, and I think if I had been born in a very different era, I would have been classified as having ADHD. And sometimes I wonder if I even may be on the spectrum. I think most docs are probably on the spectrum to a certain extent, but you start recognizing these patterns of behavior in people, and there's a concept of what's referred to as neuroregulation. How do you regulate your how do you regulate your system so that it achieves this level of balance? You might see people, even in church, you have some people who are waving their hands because they're experiencing the music, but they may also be doing that because they're stimming, because that's a way of regulating their system. We regulate our bodies through movement. We've always done that as a people, through dance and through singing, and even just the vibrations that occur because of how somebody sings a note, or how a drum is played, and the repetitiveness of those instruments can be very calming. When you hear the bells and the gongs, I didn't hear it today. I remember before you had the gongs at the end, summing the end of service. When you would hear that, it creates a level of tranquility. It's like, wow, you would feel a certain way when I was in Ethiopia with my wife. You hear the same kind of thing. So these are different things that we've done historically as people, but not even realizing what these things are doing to regulate our bodies. And so as a physician in these spaces, as a healthcare provider, you've got to figure out, what can I do to regulate my system in this space? Do I need to move? Do I need to hum? Do I need to sing something in my head? Do I need to recite a mantra? Do I need to recite a prayer? Do I need to provide something that's going to create some sort of words of power to get me to that space so that I can be present and be mindful of what's going on, so that I can extract information from the different people around me and take care of them and help them become their best.
Wow. Wow.
Okay.
So, folks, Dr. Rob deals with people who have gunshots, stabbed, bludgeoned, run over, all sorts of violence he has to look at. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but if I see something that's uncomfortable, I want to throw up just looking at something or smelling blood or anything like that. How do you separate what you're seeing and what you're doing and what you may or may not be feeling?
How do I separate what I'm doing, what I'm seeing, and from what we're experiencing? Again, I have to separate it into two phases of my life: pre and post panic attack. Pre panic attack, you learn how to compartmentalize your emotions, and that's what's required. You got to tuck things away, and you're supposed to go back and revisit it. But when you're under that constant duress, most people don't go back to it. Excuse me. You don't go back to those stress that's been compartmentalized, and so it starts to eat at you over time. And sometimes people start wondering, why am I drinking? Why am I self-medicating? Why am I feeling anxious or jittery when I come into certain spaces? And it's often because we've never processed the stress. We've never processed these different unique experiences, and sometimes not so unique experiences of trauma that we've had in our lives that we're seeing. So that's when I would compartmentalize the emotions. I kind of go about my business and forget it. But until your responsibilities start to increase, it can start to take a toll. And in 2015, my mentee Willis Young was stabbed multiple times. Willis worked with CABI, our violence intervention program, and he grew up on the block that I live on in Bed-Stuy. And it was July 22nd, 2015. That was my morning wake-up call. It was my birthday. And I was called to say, you need to come to the hospital because Willis is in critical condition. Willis did violence intervention work, and he responded to situations. He diffused conflicts. He was amazing at what he did. But to have my morning wake-up call, to have to go to the hospital, to the emergency department, because he was now a patient, where he did mediation and intervention, was completely dysregulating. Because he worked for our organization, which is called CABI, the Kings Against Violence Initiative, because he lived on the block, or used to live on the block that I lived on, and had family and friends who were still living there, because he worked at the hospital, and because he was connected to all these people, I was the intermediary for all those different parties. And I'm still practicing as a physician, so while he was in the hospital for 2 weeks in the ICU, going in and out of surgery to repair, he had been stabbed maybe 8 or 9 times by someone that he knew. I never took a break. I just kept going. I would leave the ER on shift and have somebody cover my area, and I would run upstairs and check on him in the ICU. On my days off, I wasn't supposed to be seeing patients, but I was still up at the hospital. And then when we got the news that he passed, it was devastating, but I still didn't take any breaks. I didn't take any vacation. I kept going. And we buried him we had his funeral a few weeks later. Because we were trying to raise money for the funeral. And the night of the funeral, I still didn't take a break. The service was around 11 or 12 o'clock at one of the churches over in Bed-Stuy, around the corner from us. And they had the repast on the block. And I didn't really go. I said what's up to a couple of people, but I didn't go to anybody's house. I didn't go anything. I went back inside because I was like, I need to get some rest because I'm working an overnight shift. And I was working the overnight shift in our critical care and trauma emergency department, which was the same place that he had been brought. And I was already having these feelings of uneasiness just in general since his passing and since he got injured, having a little bit of anxiety, and apprehension, just being, more angry, more than anything. But when he, the night of his funeral, I go into the emergency, I go into that area, I called the ER because I was running late. And one of the nurses who I'd grown up with said, Kimani's brother is here and he's a patient. Kimani was a kid that I pronounced dead a few years prior. He was shot and killed by NYPD. And this is a kid who died in front of me, I pronounced dead, and his brother had come in and was shot multiple times. He was stable, which was the good news, but then, we went in the room and, they recognized me. And I had to tell him about his injuries, and he was kind of looking at me like, why do you look so familiar? And, he recognized and realized, I was like, I took care of your brother. So he did the sign of the cross, and then all of a sudden this guy who was really hardened and really upset about what was going on, his whole report just completely shifted. And then the mother came in. Because he was like, tell my mother, what was going on, because he had to have some more tests. And she said, don't tell her who you are. She said, I already know who you are. You cut your hair, you cut your locks. And so I'm feeling uneasy again, and I have to explain to her, this mother, that her son, who's been shot multiple times on the stretcher right here, is stable, but he's got to stay, and he needs to have some other testing done to make sure that he stays safe. And she thanked me, and then when I would give updates on the different diagnostic studies, he had to have some CAT scans and things like that. When I gave her the updates, she was rocking her grandbaby, and she was rocking, looking just like this. She wouldn't look at me. She would talk to me, but she wouldn't make eye contact. And so every update I gave her, she wouldn't make eye contact. I knew why. I told her 16-year-old son had been killed, and I didn't even know he was killed by the police at that time. And then when it came to make that final decision that he was going to be admitted to the hospital for observation, she looks at me and she's crying, and she said, did my son say anything to you before he died? And then my body just locked up, because this is a kid who was still alive, and it was like mumbling, like don't let me die, and shaking, and was like pale. And then she said, why does this keep happening to my family? Because she's got one kid on the stretcher. She has another one who she buried a few years before, and she had another nephew who had been killed, shot and killed a few months prior, and my body locked up, and I started shaking. This is probably around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I started breathing heavy, I started sweating, and I had to run into the bathroom, and I'm throwing water on my face, and I'm crying, and I'm sweating, and I'm having I'm breathing heavy, I'm having a panic attack. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I realized what was happening, because I treat people with this stuff all the time, but now all of a sudden I'm the provider, but now I'm the patient. And I have 6 more hours to go on this shift to be able to take care of other people who are coming in, and other people who are coming in with heart attacks and strokes, and it wasn't too busy. But I was like, how do I take care of all these people? And I haven't slept in more than 24 hours because I'm, the funeral and everything else. I'm exhausted, I'm stressed, I'm triggered, and I'm dysregulated. And how can I take care of other people if I'm the patient? But because of the face that we have to show people, like, I have to keep everything together. I got to keep all this stuff together, because they can't see that I'm not confident in my decision making. If they see I'm not confident, that means they're not going to be confident. And I walked around a shift just tensing up my body. I wouldn't sit still, because if I sat still and typed in my computer writing notes, then they could see my hands were shaking. And so I just walked around at this pace, partly because I was trying to stay awake, but I'm tensing my body, tensing it. And then, if you walk around tense all day, you crash. And so I crashed when I went home. I don't know how I made it home. I don't know how I drove home. But again, I don't want people to see that I'm a patient. I don't want people to see that level of vulnerability. And every time I came up to the hospital, I started having the heavy breathing, the heart palpitations. I'm sweating. I'm having the dry mouth, and I'm having panic attacks when I'm going to the hospital. And I'm like, I was like, oh shoot! I was like, this is crazy. They're gonna put me in this building over here. And, because when I went to elementary school across the street from Kings County Hospital, and the G building was the psych building. And when you act up, they would threaten to send you to the G building, even though the G building is closed, for a number of years now. You still have that in the back of your mind. It's like, oh man, if they see me, I'm not at my best. They're gonna send me to this building, and I can't have that happen to me. Some of it's ego, but also it's just. Just realizing it's like, I don't want to admit that there's a problem that's going on. And I wound up going to therapy because I realized I was like, I can't function like this. And I've been to therapy before, but I knew that this is something that I needed to do to help figure out what was going on. And so I talk about this is the pre. Mm-hmm. The post is the therapy session. And when I went to speak to the therapist, I asked her, she's like, why do you think all this stuff is happening? And I all this stuff just kind of hemorrhaged out of me. And she said, what your problem is? Your problem is empathy. And she said, you've been taught to take on the stress and the pain of other people to create these connections with them. And you're creating these trauma bonds. he said, what really needs to happen, you need to focus on being compassionate, to showing love and being kind. And you're not distancing yourself from the person, but you're able to think clearly, and you're able to see what's happening and to be objective. Because when the emotions are running around your head, and when you're so connected to this person's pain, it starts to take over you. And you don't, we all have relatives and friends and family and coworkers. You walk into space with them, they start saying stuff, maybe even members on committees within the church. You go in these meetings and you go, and you start doing the deep breathing, because you already know that person's energy can be infectious. And you start saying things that you probably wouldn't normally say to people in a house of worship, or at least thinking it. At least thinking this stuff. But it's all because you've taken on this person's trauma and pain, because we haven't figured out a way to create distance. We haven't created a way of me saying, you know what? I can offer love to you, I can offer compassion to you, but I don't need to take on your stuff. And when the therapist told me that, it was like, I had this sigh. I was like, wow, I didn't even realize I was having these trauma bonds. And from that point on, I haven't had any problems with that since then. I wound up going to see a therapist during the pandemic. My parents said, I think you should probably see somebody because you're seeing a lot of death. And my wife was pregnant at the time with our son, and I moved out for about 10 weeks because nobody knew what was going on with COVID. And me and one of my other colleagues and friends, his wife was in her first trimester, and so he got booted out the house. So, it was like, what was it, the Odd Couple, where you just got pushed out. But what it allowed us to do, and just kind of having that community support of people who have very similar experiences, you start to learn how to talk about the stuff that you're experiencing. And we did it in real time. We wound up doing virtual therapy, so you talk about this stuff in real time. And being able to process our emotions became something that was a reflex rather than something that you do when there's something that's wrong. Finding ways to regulate our systems, our emotion, our physical body, our spiritual bodies are important. And when you don't have that, it's out of whack. You have what they call the biopsychosocial model of healthcare, which is incorporating everything from spirituality to health, fitness, wellness, and even diet. What we consume externally, what we consume internally has to be of paramount importance. And if we don't, then things wind up going away.
Well,
Yeah, that's real.
I don't mean get everybody like all quiet and stuff like that. You don't have.
You're making us think.
So doctor, tell us a story about the man who ended up on your table, who had an effect on someone else who ended up on your table.
Right. So we had there are actually two different stories. We had this one. I feel like I needed to give a positive story. There's one young man who actually was working for our organization. He's not working for us right now, but he was a patient. He had been stabbed in the neck and wound up having an injury. Then an injury stabilized and it got worse. And this was during like maybe third or fourth phase of COVID, and we weren't allowing family members to come in. He was completely freaked out. He's also a gang member. He was freaked out about what was going on from him. Didn't want to have this emergency surgery that needed to happen. And was trying to sign out against medical advice and leave the hospitals. Like, man, this dude's going to die. I wasn't around. This is stuff our staff members for our intervention program were telling me. And they became his support system. Family couldn't come in the hospital, so they became the support system every day. And even in the ER, he was like, you got ops or something? He was like, no, we do violence intervention work, and we need to make sure that you're safe. We're your advocate. So if you have something that's going on, we will speak on your behalf and bring these needs to the team, especially if you don't understand what they're saying. And he's like, all right, and eventually wound up having this surgery. And they were with him through recovery, through the surgery, through recovery, and during that, that post-op time. And he's like, why do these people keep coming in here every day, checking on me? He's not used to people being supportive. And, eventually, he winds up working for the hospital. He eventually winds up working for our team and, providing some of those same services that were provided to him. I feel like I needed to kind of change and kind of bring a lighter note just for that. because we realize that the support systems do actually have major outcomes in people's lives as long as you're persistent. It's no different than parenting, which my wife and I are learning every day through the eyes of and through the lens of caring for a very unique and energetic and spirited 3.5-year-old. But the consistency has to be there. When that support doesn't happen, we see a lot of the trauma and tragedy. I was fortunate. I did a TED Talk a number of years ago in 2016, and I spoke of this story. There's a young man who I took care of, who I pronounced dead. He got shot in the face and the chest, and I intubated him. His mandible, his jaw had completely crumbled in my hand, and but we still weren't able to save him. I ran out of that room right after I intubated him because I had to run into the next room because there was another guy who had been shot in the back or the belly of the back. We just know he had 2 wounds. One that may have come out in the front, one that may have come out in the back. But when I ran into that room, like a few seconds later, while the rest of the trauma team took care of this other guy, the guy who wound up being pronounced dead, this other gentleman I was taking care of, who was going to be going to the operating room to have an exploratory laparotomy to make sure his intestines and his internal organs were okay, I noticed he had a wound on his back. He said he'd been shot before. We found out from the detectives later is that the guy who was still alive had been shot a few years prior by the guy that I pronounced dead. The guy that I pronounced dead. So when I went out into the hallway to give the news to the family, this other guy, the trauma team, declared this guy dead. One guy dead who got shot in the face and the chest. They run to the other room that I was in where I got this other guy stabilized. They take him up to the operating room to do the exploratory laparotomy. I go out into the hallway to go speak to the family, and there's a woman who's coming down the hall, and she's like, Doc. I'm like, hey, how you doing? What's going on? She said, you remember me? I said, yeah, I remember you. She said, yeah, you remember you took care of me a few months ago? I was like, yeah, I remember you. She said, yeah, you took care of us. Thank you for taking care of us. She had a miscarriage. And she had a miscarriage maybe a few months earlier. And I was like, what's going on? I was like, what happened? What are you here for? She said, there was a big shooting over in Flatbush, over on East 20-something and Flatbush Avenue. She said, and there were a bunch of people shot. I said, yeah, I know about what happened. I was going to say, well, my boyfriend was one of the people who was shot. And I was like, oh shoot, and I'm getting that feeling. And I was like, what's his name? She said, you remember him? Remember you were with us. You told me and him that we had the miscarriage. And then it clicked. He was the guy who I just pronounced dead.
Oh my God.
And I'm usually pretty good about managing emotions and to be able to make sure that people understand what I'm saying, but I couldn't. This is in the hallway, Kings County. I've been in that hallway many a time. Unfortunately, I've been in the hallway the past few weeks, delivering that same news. But when I saw her, she said the name. I couldn't hold it, and she started crying immediately. It's kind of like stuff confirmed on the street, and I pronounced this person that I had a connection with. And you never know what you say and the words that you use and how they're going to impact somebody, and even providing support systems, no matter how minuscule or how meaningless you might perceive them. If somebody doesn't have their basic needs met, they aren't going to fare well. And basic needs go from everything from food, clothing, shelter, security, and even safety systems. I don't know if we had linked that person, that young man up to some sort of counseling services after they were having a tough time after the miscarriage, if that was going to have an impact. But the point is that we had a connection, and just kind of going back to it, you always kind of go back and almost do an inventory and what went well, what didn't go well, as almost a debriefing. And you go, man, what could I have provided that could have been something different to that patient, to that family? For the person who came in, who had been shot, who was in the operating room, what kind of things could we have provided to him and his family when he came in shot the first time? What kind of support systems, whether it's through, helping get some sort of family resources, helping get connected to a job. So when the fire commissioner upstairs spoke about the fire department and offering employment, I know some people are kind of like, oh, why are we mixing business with pleasure? Not pleasure, but why are we talking about things that are tied to, the fire commissioner? Is this something that is tied to, are they up for re-election or whatever else? But I looked at it, I was like, man, I wish more places of worship, I wish more organizations would offer opportunities for people to apply for employment. That allow
Yes,
people to take care of their
yes,
families.
absolutely.
That was a huge thing, and we work with, by the way, people who aren't familiar with the fire department in New York. I know I'm kind of going off topic, but fire department not just does not just the firefighters, they run EMS. So all the ambulances, the first responders to any situation, that's the fire department. So when she said that, I was like, wow, that's a very, very powerful thing that was articulated in service, because you have so many people who are trying to figure out how do I pay for housing? How do I pay for my kids' tuition? How do I pay for my meals? You have a son or a daughter or a nephew or whatever pronoun people might use, that somebody living with me, somebody I'm caring for, and they need an opportunity. They want to do something, but I don't know where to even point them. And they've been so discouraged behind these jobs that they're applying for. And now you have something that's concrete, something that's meaningful, something that can really lead to complex careers that somebody's offering. So I'm looking to figure out, how do you connect all these different dots together so that those support systems are maintained? For people here who, I don't want to take up too much more time, but for people here, what is our role? What is our role as members of the community? What is our role as members of the congregation? Whether you're a teaching artist, I say teaching artist because my brother Bayate right here, Bayate and I wrote the first curriculum for CABI many moons ago in a coffee shop by NYU when it was a fledgling of an idea. But how do different members of the community, from those who are in our technical professions, those who are in our creative professions, how do we provide opportunities that ensure the growth and can help other people take care of themselves? We like to care for ourselves. We don't want to be dependent. Coexistent, different story. Synergistic, even better. But having these pipelines of opportunity become very important. And it becomes essential for the survival of the community itself. A conversation my dad and I had a long time ago, this is when we were doing development work in Haiti for a pretty long stretch. We've been training drivers and laborers in first aid and emergency response and doing some really comprehensive community building. There was really community organizing, but tied to the medical community. He said, and this also kind of lends to a conversation that, but this is Bayate Ross Smith. Bayate is a Harlemite and a filmmaker and artist who had did a very powerful film. He has many powerful works, but one film that he did that was at Sundance was called Question Bridge. And Question Bridge was about black male identity. And there was someone in Question Bridge who spoke about, Question Bridge looked at black male identity as elders and young people asking questions of each other, and we're providing the solutions. And there was somebody in Question Bridge that said, why didn't you give us the blueprint? And he was speaking about older civil rights leaders. He said, why didn't you give us the blueprint? And then it reminded me of the conversation my dad and I had when we were doing a lot of the work in Haiti. And he said, if you don't plan for your successors, then these institutions that we've created wind up dying out with the founders. That it has these have to be planned out in very, very careful, very intentional ways, so that the institutions, I was already going to say this, but Reverend Hoggart had spoken about that today. You have to plan for the successors. If not, the hard work, the ancestors whose blood, sweat, and tears, the development that's taking place will wind up dying out and be a part of some archive.
That's true.
You
That's
know what?
true.
Listen, Dr. Robert Gore, you're among my heroes. I've watched you, gosh, I've been in Abyssinian for 32 years, so I've watched you become who you are from a distance and hearing from your dad you know, when your son was born and hearing about how much joy he brings to you, and even when you have to clean up after him, putting a mess in the back of your car yesterday,
Uh-huh.
and seeing yourself in this new person that you've created with your wife. We really appreciate what you've done with us today. We love what you've been doing in treating and taking care of some of the violent things that have been happening in our community. If it wasn't for you, who would be doing it? And I think God made you so that you would be in this space right now to help heal the people. Even people that have not done wonderful things in their lives, but you're still here to help them heal and have another chance to do things differently. We thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you.
Okay.
And maybe you can come back again if you like. I know it's really, he's like so busy, but maybe he can come back
I'll come
again
back.
and we can talk about
Yeah.
Kavi. And we
Yeah,
can talk
that's
about
what I
your
wanted
brother
to
who's
know
a
more about.
filmmaker, and-
Yes.
And we can see what we can do to help save our brothers and our sisters who
Mhm.
were victims of crime, et cetera, et cetera. And
Let's do it.
let's rock and roll and heal.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Okay.
Also, if anybody has a book I can sign right here, we still have some books there
And I'll
available.
get lunch together.
Thank
But no,
you.
thank you all for coming through. Thank you for supporting. And this was, I did see you up there. I know, I saw you make that eye contact with me, and I'm saying, how you doing?